welcome to the show, the Merry Christmas Back to Doghead show. I'm joined by Kalia today from Hawaii. Say hi, Kalia. Transmitting in.
Hello.
And I'm also joined by Brannon Parker from Hawaii as well. Merry Christmas, Brannon.
Hey, Merry Christmas, Mele Kaliki Maka, as we say in Hawaii.
And that's a fun thing to say indeed.
Yeah.
On today's show, I'm joined by these two scholars in Vedic and Vaishnava and intercultural studies. And they've been and scholars and friends since the 90s when they were doing the Vedic Empire production. They actually have not been on camera together since the 90s when they did that production. So do you guys want to tell me a quick aside about that experience for you?
Mid-90s, after going to the Sinclair Library day after day and finding this incredible treasure trove of books from India with all these amazing scholars. I don't know, we did that for some months, and then suddenly we're like, this information isn't known by anyone, but it's amazing. So why don't we figure out some way to get this out to the public? And at the time, this was pre-internet, wasn't a big thing yet, no cell phone, nothing. But we had public access stations, which are still going actually. And we just started doing a talk show on the Olelo public access, and it all exploded from there, a transcendental explosion of knowledge and culture. And Kalia and I and Atmarama and Sri McKee, among others, were there at the forefront. So it's definitely historic to be back with you, Neil. Kalia.
Yes, it is good. Ho, ho, ho. And
yeah, you've got the full gray beard looking since then. It's been
well,
that long,
I'm here as I'm not actually Santa, but I do realize I make a good Santa, you know, but I'm supposed to be one of Santa's helpers. I'm supposed to be one of his elves.
Hello, Mele Kaliki Maka. Here we are in Hawaii, and I got my Santa elf helper cap, and that's the theme. And so why is this the theme for this show? Well, basically, in ancient India, as many people may or may not know, but millions of people do know, obviously, we have the Ramayana. And one of the key characters in the Ramayana, one of the greatest heroes of the Ramayana, if not the greatest, is Hanuman, the so-called monkey god, the Vanara. And he's this giant being who has the power to become a giant. He could also make himself smaller than the smallest, but he's many times presented as this giant monkey warrior who carries God, Lord Rama, and his brother, who's also God, Lakshman, on his shoulders. And he carries them all over through the war, across the water. And it's one of the most popular images of Hanuman and the Lord for Ram devotees and Vaishnavas is this ideal, this image of Lord Hanuman, or Sri Hanuman carrying Lord Ramachandra, God, on his back. It's his joyous service that he has. And what's very interesting and how this ties into the Santa theme is there's an ancient Judeo-Christian tradition of a saint named Saint Christopher. And he also is presented as this giant being that carries the Lord on his back across the waters. But rather than a monkey face, he has a dog face, and he has a dog head, basically. And that's why the theme of the show is Back to Doghead. So what is this? Is there some connection? Because this Saint Christopher has the same exact role as a servitor Lord, a warrior giant being who carries God on his back across the water. But the only stark difference, immediate difference that we see is the dog face versus the monkey face. So is there a connection between Saint Christopher and Hanuman? Or is it based on some speculation? Some people say, oh, it's representative of the people of Canaan, the Canaanites. Or does it really represent the canine? And is there a correlation between dog face and monkey face?
Thank you for that introduction, Vrindavan. And welcome to the Back to Godhead Christmas Special 2022 Extravaganza.
All right, Back to Godhead by talking about Back to Doghead.
Yeah. We'll be talking about the dog-faced feature of Saint Christopher and how that relates to Hanuman, the Hindu god and servant of the Lord Rama of the Ramayana tradition. But first, let me introduce my co-host for today on the Back to Doghead Christmas special. Firstly, we have giving us the hook of our campaign, our means of endeavor for spreading truth. Brannon spent 10 years living in indigenous North Indian dormitories studying Sanskrit, Hindi, and ancient Vedic literature. While there, he received formal Harinam Diksha initiation from A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and was given his Sanskrit name of Vrindavan. So some people know him as Brandon Parker, but he is also Vrindavan Parker, disciple of Prabhupada. And in 1999, Brannon began studying the ancient world's originally interconnected sacred traditions under the guidance of Bhaktivedanta Goswami. The 2012 book of his, called Serpent, Eagle, Lion, and the Disc, represents a culmination of Brannon's own research combined with his study of key elements of Bhaktivedanta Goswami's thesis. How was that? How was that for you, Brannon? Did you?
Oh, it's great. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for reminding me as well, because without Srila A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada and the guidance of Sri Bhaktivedanta Goswami, I would not have a clue as the true history of the world or reality at large. So thank you. I'm happy to be here.
That's my sentiment too. Bhaktivedanta Goswami is a very knowledgeable religious historian, and something that everyone on this show has in common is that we are all once students of his. Our next co-host that I'll be introducing is Kalia, and he is one of Honolulu's, Hawaii's eminent and popular artists. He did some of the graphics we'll be presenting in this program.
Popular
and and humble too.
Yeah.
And he makes murals that decorate a lot of Honolulu's premier clubs, venues, halls, and temples. He's a musician, DJ, promoter, and co-founder of Vedic Empire Productions. Vrindavan and Neil Kalia here, they have actually been media producers since the 90s, doing the Vedic Empire Productions together, where they their research of cross-cultural connections between the world's ancient traditions and languages correlate research relating to Polynesian, Native American, Sanskrit, and otherwise
all the root cultures of the world all connected, and we're finding shining spotlights on that obvious truths.
So a lot of this show does feature interlinguistic evidence, but also scriptural evidence for the claims we'll be making. I'll pass it on to you, Kalia. Thanks for joining our program.
Thank you.
Great to see you again, Neil Kalia. So many years.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, and we'll be explaining about Santa and proto-Santa archetypes, explaining about the origins, talking about elves and stuff, and going into different sources for what we colloquially know as Santa Claus for the Merry Christmas holiday.
Yeah, so like as the kind of it's not, I don't know if it's the exact title of the show, but we put Back to Doghead, so that's kind of an intriguing title. So I guess we'll be getting into that. But I wanted to say right off one thing that's very important and crucial to understanding all of this is that there's an archetype, or archetypes, I should say, at the underlying foundation of everything, of creation, basically, right? And so a good example will be throughout all the ancient cultures, you'll keep finding these serpent, snake, so-called mythologies. And it's always at the root creation levels of all these cultures, right? And so what is this? We know obviously Vedic tradition, Anantashesha, and ancient Egypt, Aten was also this snake, the serpent of creation. And so we find that serpent archetype, right? So then we come to a little bit of a conundrum, because then we come to a place like Hawaii, right? And there are no snakes, right? But lo and behold, the archetype represented by the divine serpent is still central to the tradition. But instead of a snake, it's the mo'o, which is a lizard, serpentine, reptilian creature as well. And it fulfills every role of the divine serpent, but this in a lizard form. And we see that same thing, right? With the eagles, right? The hawks, the falcons, the vultures, and even the Kane, who's actually Krishna, the divine creator in the Polynesian tradition. There's no eagles all over these small little Pacific islands, though we do have hawks in Hawaii, but they're not as big as the huge albatross. It's like the biggest bird in the Pacific Ocean. So that's the carrier for Kane, the creator. So what I'm trying to say is, so sometimes we'll find different variations on these different themes, but if you boil it down to the exact archetype, it's the same everywhere you go in every culture, everywhere in the world. So with that said, this theme back to Doghead, what is the Doghead and how does it connect to, you know, Santa and Christmas? Because obviously we got our Santa hat, Santa outfit. This is the first day of Christmas. So what's going on there, Kalia and Elijah? Why Doghead?
Ho, 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 ho. That, yeah, right. It's back to Doghead, to laugh. What does that have to do with Santa Claus, is what you're saying? What is that? Well, that's the saying, because they say back to Godhead. So that's a traditional saying. So we're just today turning that on its ear. You know, not to be, because we're talking about Saint Christopher and the relation of Saint Christopher with Santa Claus and that tradition. So, you know, yeah, you might not suspect that there would be a relationship with it. And there's probably no way at all I can explain everything within the short time we have, but just to give you some basic points about it and everything. So, yeah, what's the relation with the Doghead? Saint Christopher, as we know. What's the relation with the monkey man, Hanuman? What's the relation? That relation with Santa Claus, Santa's helper, the elves and things like this. And also we have characters like the Shakespearean Puck, you know, who is the Pookie, and his laugh was so ho, 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 ho. You know, he used to laugh like that. And this is traced back to like 13th century Europe, at least. So it's probably, you know, you might suspect it even earlier than that. However, we understand Puck was a shape-shifting servant, or even a son of Oberon, the you know, the fairy lord, the fairy god, or the fairy king. And he was the trickster that played lots of tricks in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream and all that. But he was also a chimney sweep. He laughed ho, 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 in every other verse of the poetry of the Mad Pranks and the merry jest of Robin Goodfellow. You see that this is the poetry. He's laughing ho, ho, ho. He's got the chimney. He's got the ashes. He's got this and that. And yet, if you look at the images of Robin Goodfellow, you're going to see the images of the European wild man. So this is one of the things. And how is that related to Christopher the Doghead? Well, we'll try to explain it as best as we can in the short time we can. So.
So yeah, part of the reason that we named it Back to Doghead is because there's some Orthodox iconography of like Saint Christopher as like as a martyr in their tradition, and he has like a dog's head in the iconography. So like some people like might speculate that this is like a race of dog beings, and some people or maybe that's like bona fide and that's like pursuant of this Vedic version.
Well, see what we see Saint Christopher related is a cherubim order, the angelic order of cherubim, seraphim, all these different angelic orders. And we know that the cherubim, according to the Bible, how they're described and how they're usually depicted and so on, is a winged person. And they're ordered, I mean, all these different orders of angels have the duty of messengers, and they also are vehicles for the Lord. And often you'll see these, Babylonian, Assyrian, all the way till, and the idea is, and they're sitting on these caravan thrones and all these stuff. So these are their vehicles. And they're described in the Bible, the biblical tradition, as cherubim, and another word for them is Kalia, the holy beast. And you know about the four evangelists. I was trying to briefly go about that. When you see that, the four, writers of the New Testament, Matthew, Luke, Mark, John, so on and so on, depicted as four evangelists. Now, this was also certified by the church fathers, like Gregory the Great, if I believe so. If not, please correct us. But I believe, so they actually certified that this was a genuine representation of those messengers and things like this. Saint Christopher, the Doghead, or whether he's depicted in two forms. He's depicted in the Doghead, which we find in early forms from like the 7th, at least as early as the 6th century, 7th century. Around there, about that time, I believe. And we find that he's referred to as Doghead all along this time. Then you see this portrait of St. Christopher as this giant. And the only thing that St. Christopher has that distinguishes him from all the other saints is that he carries Christ. Not that other saints are not seen to have carried Christ, but his name specifically means, and is named after the sense that he's a Christ bearer. So we have this idea of this cherubim type of, vehicle in St. Christopher. Now, as far as the other correlations, there's so many that it's pretty hard to deny, because we're looking at a much bigger picture. We're looking at not just St. Christopher, but we're looking at relations with Hanuman and Santa Claus and all of this. And you have to remember this St. Nick, and that's a whole other thing I might not be able to explain in this very short amount of time. But, we're looking at a whole array of messenger deities, or the main deities of God in all of these traditions. And in this case, in Hanuman and Garuda, we understand that they pair together. And as we see in Michael and St. Christopher, just to name one example, we also have like Hermes and Iris in the Greek and so on. And these are all the main messenger deities of Godhead, So you see their forms. As you see Michael, he's in the form of the cherubim. Now, this is how we just said about the cherubim being described as fashioned for the Ark of the Covenant and commanded by God himself, right, in the Bible, to be fashioned like that. And so this is one of the images that were actually commanded, to Moses to form this. And you see the general idea of the images is the winged angels. So if this is true, then you have to put Michael in the same category. And so you're going to see that Garuda is a birdman. Sometimes he's described as an eagle, but the overwhelming images that you're going to see of Garuda are all the birdman, So he's the main messenger of Vishnu, and that's a long, detailed story about how, he's compared directly with Hanuman. But basically, you see them always together. They're either on the sides, the emblems of Vishnu, they're either amalgamated together as one deity. And in the Ramayana, Valmiki Ramayana, just to be specific, Hanuman is compared directly to Garuda in so many aspects, as far as
just to be
and
clear,
and so on.
so just to be clear, you're saying Archangel, the Michael, the Archangel, and Saint Christopher, Michael correlates to Garuda. Saint Christopher correlates to Hanuman. First question.
Yes.
Okay. And then second question is Saint Christopher, a historical saint from like post Jesus, post AD era, or is he in the level of Michael the Archangel?
No, how do I understand Saint Christopher's story coming from the martyrdom? As far as I understand, now I don't claim to know everything, because that's, but as far as I understand, the early apocrypha containing the stories of Saint Christopher as he is accepted as a saint today, those came from anywhere around 2nd, 5th century AD.
So how did the Garuda Hanuman motif get into the Christian tradition?
How did the Garuda? Because we have the Greeks going to India, we have this communication going on. We know from at least 3rd century BC, right? We see the same ideas going back and forth, and especially we have like Sir William Jones. Okay, Sir William Jones. Now he was in the 18th century. He was a high court judge at Calcutta. He was an Orientalist, you know. He founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal, all this stuff. He was one of the first persons to surmise the relationship between, you know, to promote the relationship between Indo-Europeans, especially knowing that he was reading all the Sanskrit. He knew like 30 different languages, you know what I mean? And he could speak 15 different languages fluently. You know, I mean, the guy was kind of like a genius. Well, back in the 18th century, this is kind of like what he has to say about it. I mean, if I can just find it for a second. He says, it was superfluous in any mere essay to reign at any length in parallel between this European god, Bacchus or Dionysus, and the sovereign of Ayodhya, Lord Ram. To have command and achieve a numerous intrepid race of those large monkeys, which are naturalists, and some of them have dominated Indian satyrs. His general, the prince of satyrs, was named Hanuman. The first poet of the Hindus is great Valmiki, and his Ramayana is an epic poem of the same subject, which in unity and action, magnificence and imagery, and elegance and style, far surpasses the learned and elaborate work of Nonus entitled Dionysiaca. I shall never have leisure, but I'm confident that an accurate comparison of the two poems would prove Dionysus and Ram to have been the same person. So this is Sir William Jones surmising something, the connection between Hanuman, the satyr retinue or attendants of Dionysus and Lord Ram himself. So, and of course, he's, you know, putting this out there, but he's referring specifically to Nonus here in the 5th century AD. But 8 centuries before this, you have the Indica, fragments of the Indica coming down from Ctesias, Megasthenes, and you see that they have the same kind of connotations of Dionysus.
Indica.
Ctesias and but Megasthenes Indica, yeah.
Yeah, you were mentioning.
Oh, right. So I'm just mentioning that because the same kind of theme of Dionysus being in India and being a lord of India was the same thing, as we know, with the city of Mathura and sort of saying, and that mention of Kleshapura and all that stuff we were talking about. So even back at that time.
But just to be clear, that was all the last sentence. That's all from the Greek book called Indica. It's like 2,000 years old book or more. And they directly talk about Mathura, the Surasenas, all these direct links to Krishna. Yeah, that's a great one. I love that. Yeah.
And even at this time, though, you see, Dionysus was conquering India. And in Nonus' book, the Dionysiaca, it's the same thing, you know, that Dionysus conquers India and he conquers the evil Indian king named Dariatus. And yet Dionysus, rather than Ram, here has a satyr army. So this is what Sir William Jones is specifically referring to, and anybody who's even looked at the Dionysiaca for a little bit and knows about the Ramayana will understand that the Dionysiaca appears to be the Ramayana turned on its head, with the Greeks and Dionysus invading India, and you know what I'm saying.
So you're saying that like Dionysus is invading India would be like likened to Rama invading Lanka but Dionysus has an army of satyrs.
Right, the satyr. Right. Yeah. And the satyr army is a Vanara army. Now, anyway, it's so, like I said, it's so in depth. It's really hard to explain everything in a short amount of time. That's why I put a little bit of the PDF out, just to kind of like get a general idea of how, you know, many parts there. But okay, now as far as Saint Christopher's relation with Hanuman, but that's just an early mention of how it got into the European literatures and stories and circulated there. Not just amongst the Greeks, but it went all the way into Western Europe, Russia, and things like this. And this is why you find the legend, that Saint Christopher in the form of this dog head. But
Neil, so just to be clear, you have research showing these ancient Christian iconography, which shows the saint with a dog head, right? And his name is Saint Christopher, and he carries the Lord the same way Hanuman carries Lord Rama on his shoulders. He carries Rama Lakshman. So is there any chance that it could be a mistake by artists who saw images of Hanuman and thought it was a dog, and they changed it to a dog face?
Right. This is why we, in the Chinese, you have Sun Wukong. And I kept hearing his name. I'm looking for it because I know about the Monkey King, right? Me and Brannon, we got to talk to the professor of Beijing, Beijing Academy of Sciences back in 2002. Remember the interview?
Yeah, I remember Professor Huang. He called himself the last remaining indigenous Hindu of China. And he passed away now, the late doctor, but he was like China's leading expert on Vedic connections to ancient China. And yeah, we interviewed him. Actually have a video of you interviewing him. We have to get that out there sometime soon.
Yeah, I have a lot of that video. Unfortunately, it's there's a background noise, but I was able to at least get some of it out. And the part where he's talking about the Ramayana being introduced in the 3rd century AD. So we know that the Ramayana was in China, 3rd century. So we have all these different recensions coming now about the monkey pilgrim and so on before we finally have the 14th, 16th century monkey king Sun Wukong. So when I kept hearing his name, Sun Wukong, I was listening to the Chinese, I guess they have the different Cantonese and Mandarin and so on. But and I kept hearing Sun Wukong. So I'm thinking, why did they say this? So the name there, the way they use the category for this dog radical, where they insert into their characters, is the same kind of taxonomic methods that the Greeks use, the Latin is used, and the Greeks. So the name for Shun being that of monkey is the same name of Shun being that of dog. And I tried to elaborate on that kind of thing on the
wow, that's very
PDF,
interesting. That's a good connection there.
In the same way, you have the words Cynocephalus, Cynomolgus, which are all names of dogs that are names of monkeys. And these are, of course, Latin categories, but they're coming down from the Greeks. Like you have Cynocephalus hamadryas, which is the Egyptian baboon. And you have Cynomolgus, which in that category includes the red-faced macaques, which are like Hanuman and so on. So when you're hearing this, Sino, and it's coming down from these apocryphal, kind of like this flow coming down into Europe and stuff, you're translating it as directly as possible, not being familiar with that kind of simian breeds that, go further, that are not known in Europe so much. So there's 2 types of translations there. One of the types of translation was the giant, Christopher. And this is how you usually see St. Christopher. He's a giant size and so on. And then you see he's in the Doghead St. Christopher. Because the Doghead being translated straight from the words for Sino, meaning in the Greek, monkey. These
I
different
just
types
wanted
of
to
monkeys.
be clear, Kalia. So obviously, the ancient Judaic traditions. We have Archangel Michael. So obviously St. Christopher's within that so-called pre-Christ era as well, right? He's within the Judaic tradition as well, right? Also, and in that tradition, does it match the Christian perspective? Dog face, giant, carrying the Lord.
Well, as we said, we were talking about the 4 evangelists, and according to that, that's certified is a genuine, way to represent the messengers of God. And we know that we're seeing these cherubim-like forms. We're seeing ones with heads of bulls. In fact, in some images, if you look at these four apostles, you're going to think to yourself, well, look, wow, he almost looks like a demon because he's got the bull horns and he's got these wings and stuff like this. So in some images, I'm not saying all of them, you know what I mean? And in other images, you see it's a quasi-form kind of being, you know, a lot like we see, you know, with four heads of different types and maybe 6 wings and things like this. So it's a cherubim.
I remember there was some destruction of like of a city having to do with one that the similarities of the story were strikingly similar in that way.
Oh no, that's the other thing you find in the backstory. And see, this is what totally convinces me that it comes from the Ramayana, the story of Christopher, is because if you're looking at these different apocrypha, now you have Andrew, Matthias, Andrew, Bartholomew, Saint Christopher, the Passions of Saint Christopher. Then you have the Ethiopic Gadla Hawayat. I think that's how you say it, Hawayat. And that's a Apostolum Certumum, as they call it, or the lives of the apostles, or the struggles, or whatever. You know, and all of these, you know, what I'm saying, they're referring to, let me see. So, yeah, in all of these different recensions. Now, would you have the descriptions of the, and this is why I need my PDF in front of me. I don't have it right now, but I could put it here. And this is probably why I'm trying to say it takes so long to go through it. But basically you have, because those are the categories. You have the categories of,
yeah, I have some of your categories here. I just couldn't find it a moment ago.
Okay, no.
What I'm trying to mention now is after there's a crossing in the water, then they find themselves in Lycia, the land of wolves. This is a pastime of St. Christopher's. Okay, I should mention that the meeting has about 3 minutes left of recording time, and then we'll have to take a commercial break.
Okay, well, anyway, I'll just try to say this briefly. There's so many different categories. There's probably at least 15 different categories I enumerated that are pretty much identical. Some of them almost verbatim from the Ramayana to the Apocrypha of St. Christopher. Now, when you're dealing with St. Christopher, some people will say, well, I mean, I was told about, well, is this the meaning of Canaanite being mistaken as a cynocephalus or as canine or something? But in the early Greek, that's what we find, the word that even though he's from the land of Canaan, he's considered a cynocephalus. And even in the Latin, we find the words canine to describe his appearance. But besides all that, we find also in the Ethiopic recension that's related to it, the god Haryawat, we find that he's also called Gatsakalev, which means face of a dog. And this is clearly the same story as St. Christopher, you know. So in this case, you have confirmation that all of these stories are referring to a dog-headed, or because they're not only mentioning him as a dog-head, they're mentioning him as a cannibal. And in this Andrew and Bartholomew, they go to the land of the cannibals. And this is where they meet Gatsakalev, which literally means face of a dog. And that's in the Ethiopic. And Gatsakalev, as you can see, is pretty much every part of his, you know, activities and actions, you know, they resemble St. Christopher's. And there's a few that are a little bit different, you know, here or there, but basically it's the same idea. And he takes the, you know, ordained name as Christianus, you know, just as St. Christopher is formerly Replicus, and he takes the name St. Christopher when he becomes a servant of Christ. Well, basically when he meets the Christ child while crossing the water. So all of these, not just St. Christopher crossing the water, but you have to remember, these are the, from the Apocrypha, Andrew Matthias, Andrew Bartholomew, Saint Christopher, the Passions of Saint Christopher, and as we said, that God the Halawat, which is actually separate in one sense from them because it only contains a few of the same as the Greek. But anyway,
yeah, well, we'll have to get right back into those 15 points after this commercial break.
well, okay, no, Santa Carona. Well, I was being asked about Saint Christopher. Okay, what you were saying, referring to that, yeah, all glory to Shankara Shan. Is that right? All glory to the lords of the island who are Kani, Kanaloa. And that is also, of course, other names would be the little brother and the elder brother. And as we know, this is widely spread idea, and we find it also in the name Kaniya with Krishna, little brother, and with Lord Dwaladev, elder brother. And so these and the goddesses of the island, such as Mother Pele, Mother Laka, Mother Kapo, we find that we ask them for the mercy, and yes, we say to the mercy of Srila Prabhupada, because he was such, I mean, before reading these books, we probably could not understand, even though I had never, like you, of course, to have the mercy of actually meeting his grace. But at the same time, I understand that without science, without religion, means merely speculation, religion without science, sentiment. Now, the other day we were talking about this, somebody said, well, what does this mean? You know, it doesn't mean that, you know, you're in the room doing chemistry and, you know, taking experiments and doing religion at the same time. That's not the meaning of it. It means practicality has to be applied. So, yeah, and so we got science. And we can apply that science. And if we look around the world, we're looking at ancient traditions and things like that. We see that, yes, it's an applicable science to all these mystic spiritual traditions around the world, you know. So one of them is we are being asked about Saint Christopher, and so, but as we were trying to explain about Saint Christopher, he's the cherubim, he's a cherubim form, you know, of the messenger deity or the bearer of the Lord. And anyway, I was asked about his story, but one of the things we find, like Sir Elijah was asking us about the different categories that we can find that correspond with Hanuman. And we were talking about his going into Lycia, land of the wolves. When we correspond to Ramayana scriptures with St. Christopher's, we have the meeting in the wilderness, where we have the meeting of Andrew and Bartholomew with gods of Kalab, where they meet in, of course, it's the barbaric wilderness. These are man-eaters and so on. So you see Mercurius, Christopher, Hanuman crossing the water, ocean, entering the city unseen or bringing down the gates, bound and tortured, set aflame but unharmed, city burns and closed in fire, and reviving dead or converting the public are 7 of the categories that we find. 7 of the major categories we have, like, so who is the Doghead Saint Christopher? Now, as we understand, dogheads are nothing new to Europe. If we go back to Greece, we know about Arcus, and the first, I think, known European story of a werewolf is when Zeus turns who's the one, Lycaon, into I think it's into a werewolf, into a wolf, and so there's a tradition with that. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, is basically the idea of a wolf-headed man, half wolf, has sustained in Europe for a very long time. So Saint Christopher is not the first idea. But what's unique about Saint Christopher is that, as his name implies, he's the only saint that bears God with the God-bearing name, Christ Ophoris, which means the Mount of God. So he's the only saint that has this particular distinctive title, and he's the only saint that he has a dog head also, as we already mentioned about that. So but these categories, meeting in the wilderness, we can look at a little bit of this. So the first one is what we have here is the Lycia. Okay, so the first thing we run into here, I'm sorry. See, this is why I like to have the notes. I'm sorry. I mean, I'm an old guy, what are you supposed to say? I'm Santa's cousin. Can't you see? It's just like the beard, no resemblance there. Anyway, and so we have the first thing that Christopher his martyrdom comes at the hand of Decius, or Dacian, Daza, or Dagnus. And in the Ramayana, this would be Dashanana, the 10-headed Ravana. As we see in the Latin, this is exactly what the meaning of Decius means. We know that there are other martyrs that were martyred under the Mercurius, and apparently what scholars have decided on is that these are all posthumous placements on the emperor that in the Apocryphal. In other words, they're pretty much and so we have Dagnus also, and Dagnus is for the Greek dekana, which means 10. So this represents the 10-headed Ravan. Now, as we already talked about going to the city of man-eaters, this is one of the things. It's mentioned actually in Andrew and Matthias, Andrew, Bartholomew, in different ways. But Christopher, he's going into the city of Lycia. That's not the only city that's mentioned that Christopher finds his martyrdom in. One is Antioch, but Lycia is very popular in the different histories of Christopher. We say histories, the different versions, from the European versions, the Greeks, the Latin. Anyway, so Decius is one. That's the first one. Then we have also incidents of the same type of characters: Mercurius, Minos, and Saint Christopher becoming part of the Roman army. In this case, we're looking at the same situation. We're looking at around the time of Nonus too. Now remember, Nonus is Sir William Jones pointed out, is actually a replication of the Ramayana. It's turned on its head. This is about contemporary with the same kind of literature. And so in this case, we're turning the Ramayana, we're giving the Roman army is Rama's army. This is my, but here we have crossing the water. Now, if you don't think it is, okay, great. But we have also crossing the water. Christopher's crossing water journey to Samos and Lycia. Acts of Peter and Andrew. Jesus appeared to Andrew and sent him to Matthew in the country of man-eaters. Andrew proceeded to the coast and found a boat which Jesus had prepared. The Lord himself went with him in the disguise of a pilot. Christopher's, so
what you're reading, where's the source of this St. Christopher legends?
This is from Apocryphal Acts and Origins. This is from a history so this is where it's from. Now, here's the other part of Christopher crossing the water. And Christopher lifts up the child on the shoulders, took his staff, entered the robbery. So this is where he carries the Christ child across the water. Okay, here he is. Crossing water to land and sea. So Andrew waits 3 days with disciples, prays to Christ, and slumbers on the seashore. We have the same thing with Ram remaining 3 days on the seashore, prays to the sea god, and sleeps on the seashore. So we have the same case of Hanuman bearing Hanuman bearing the Lord Ram. We have the same case of Garuda bearing the Lord Ram. And anyway, we can get into the Ramayana episodes that parallel those of the Apocryphal. Now, the Apocryphal we were just saying was the Latin, the Greek. We're talking about anywhere from the 2nd to 5th century AD. We're talking about the beginning in the Greek, from the Latin, and we're talking about also the Ethiopic And beginning the later times, from about the 10th century, 9th century, we're talking about the European recensions that mention the story of Saint Christopher. Just like in the 13th century, we have the Golden Legend, you know, which pretty much that's kind of like the European standard for Saint Christopher's story, you know.
Yeah, it seems like there's like elements of Saint Christopher's stories that are preserved not only from the Ramayana, but like there's like stages in between. Like there's like types of martyrs that are also dog-headed, like Hermanubis of the, I think the,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's all fits in there. But as far as the Ramayana background, these are the main things that happened that parallel the Ramayana. This is why I'm just going to briefly say it, because to get into the details of it, where we're each reading each line is hard to get back and, you know. But meeting in the wilderness is the first thing that happens with Lord Ram, as well as it does with Gatsa Kaleb, face of a dog. It happens with Mercurius. It happens with Christopher. Okay, crossing the water, see the ocean. As we just saw, there's several verses, several different parts describing the crossing of the water. And we can see that was parallel pretty much with Ramayana verbatim almost, where Lord Ram appeases the ocean god for 3 days and sleeps on the ocean with the Vanara army. And where Andrew and Bartholomew appease the Christ and sleep on the seashore for 3 days. And so these are some of the parts of crossing the water, but also the crossing of water. Christopher he was not, he was a giant. And before his meeting of the Christ child, his job as a Christian now, he was a Reformed Christian, you know. And so, and this is a whole thing with the reform of the wild man. And you can see this wild man. He's like the Weihnachtsmann, the Austrian Weihnachtsmann, and he becomes a Father Frost. He becomes a reformed wild man. It has everything to do with the chimney sweep. It has everything to do with the basket ogre, what's called the basket ogre, like Krampus and everything. But he becomes reformed like that. And so in the same way, St. Christopher serves the devil in the beginning, and he becomes, and at this point, his name is called Reprobus, among many other names. Reprobus, like a reprobate, you know. And finally, when he finds Christ, you know, he becomes a servant of Christ. So his job now is to help these people cross the water. And this is what he does in his giant form, is that his daily mission is now he's a Christian servant. He lives out in the wilderness, but he helps people cross the water. So this is one of the verses that are dedicated to Christopher, and is that he who bore many people across the water. Then he finally meets the Christ child. Child comes in disguise. You know, he doesn't know it's a Christ child. It's like, boom. And so all through this Apocrypha, you're going to see that Christ incognito, you know, he takes a ship pilot, Varthos, of Gatsa Kaleb, that's in Andrew Bartholomew, meets Christ incognito, you know, that's Andrew Matthias, and, you know, takes them, they sail to the city of Maneater. So in all these cases, they're crossing the water, just as Ram did in the bridge in the Lanka, going to Lanka, or Christ in disguise is the leader and crossing with the apostles, and Christopher or Gatsa Kaleb, face of the dog, to the, you know, the other side of wherever their other destinations, but they're all doing it on a boat. They're all doing it on a ship. Whereas in Ramayana, it's leaping over the ocean and it's crossing by this, you know. So at this time, he meets the Christ child. He finds, you know, he carries the Christ child. He doesn't know it's the Christ child, but then all of a sudden the weight becomes so heavy and heavy and heavy. He's like, oh, who is this kid? You know, it's like, so he's weighing ton. And then he said, and he said, the Christ child said to him something like, don't, you know, Christopher, you're bearing the weight of the world on your shoulders. You know, so this we can compare in a lot of ways, because all the universes are in me and everything and so on. So you're actually bearing all of this. So that's why you're feeling this weight. You know what I mean? So at that point, that was his first blessing with the Christ, like, you know, in a child form in disguise, you know. And so we see that with Hanuman meeting Ramayana. Ram is a prince, but he's the Lord himself, but he's incognito as a prince. And not only that, he's wandering through the forest and so on and so on. And the big episode there is crossing the water. you know, going to Lanka and the battle and all these things like this, which is we see in Christopher and Kaleb, all the parallels there. They have to enter the city disguised. Kaleb, Christopher, St. Christopher, and it doesn't explain why, but it says that he had to change his look, and it's fully explained, it's fully elaborated on the Valmiki Ramayana, where Hanuman enters a city and he has to think about, well, if he appears like this or appears like that, so he takes the form of a small cat-like, you know, form, size of a cat, and you know, the size, that's the best way. So you can see the same idea, the dilemma of entering the city in the skies, crossing the water. When they get into the city, they're bound and tortured. Now, this is all the different apocrypha: Andrew and Matthias, Andrew and Bartholomew, Christopher, Passions of Christopher, Mercurius, also Minos, also Hanuman. They're all bound and tortured and taken before Decius, taken before Doghead, or whoever is the name of the judge according to that particular recension. You know, then they're set aflame. They're all set aflame. Christopher has brought pots of oil to set him aflame, and you can see the dog-haired Christopher laying on the bed of flames in the Russian panels from the Russian, you know, the Eastern Orthodox, and Christopher with a dog head, and all the different episodes that Hanuman are going through. This is what Christopher is going through, and so he's being set. So the whole thing, and and the same thing with Hanuman. They bring him pots of oil to just slather on his tail and put him in flame. But none of them are, even though they're put in flame, they're unharmed. Christ saves Christopher, Christ saves Kaleb, Christ saves Andrew and Bartholomew, and of course Hanuman is saved by the power of all the different blessings of the deities, and of course Lord Ram, you know. So we have this and all these different recensions. This is why the scholars have already tied these together. Mercurius, St. Minos, St. Christopher pretty much have so many elements common to their story. They have to be from the same source. And so we know that, and they don't consider it genuine, this Apocrypha. It's not considered, it's just considered, you know, the Gnostic knockoff, you might say, that just kind of got recirculated. And this is from old Greek stories in Latin that were coming from India for a long time, like we were talking about, known as Dionysica, you know, and the whole idea of satyr. Yeah.
So Kalia. So just to be clear, what you're saying is that these are reflections of the Ramayana legend, Ramayana history from a perspective of faith, and rather than new pastimes, new leelas that happened within the Christ avatar, right? So, because those are two different realities. One is the Ramayana is a reality, a tradition, very ancient tradition that was brought from the East to the West by scholars and, you know, researchers and writers. And then the tradition kind of got morphed a bit into what we have presented today, what's available to us today. Or is there a chance that there actually was a whole different set of Leela or pastimes that the Lord performed in this role as Christ with his devotees who got to perform similar Leelas or relationships, rasas with the Lord as Hanuman and Ram, but this time they are in the form of Saint Christopher and Christ. You know what I'm saying? Is it just a reflection of patchy memory that was brought from India?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I mean, I'm never going to say there were no other avatars, because if I'm looking at Native American, Polynesian, I had to think that there had to be some kind of intercession, divine intercession. It could not just be a story, you know, either that same deity is visited there, or likewise, you know, something similar happened with saints on those continents long ago, you know, those kind of things. So, I mean,
yeah, exactly. Because the Vedic tradition talks about how the Leela or the pastimes of the Lord are moving through the material universe as like a wheel of fire, right? And they're not the same. You know, it's not like there's this cookie cutter Leelas that the Lord can only fit into this lockdown understanding based on what we know on this planet. They're unlimited forms, unlimited pastimes, unlimited relationships.
Right.
But a lot of times the same beings do repeat their relationships with the Lord in other universes and other time frames, even on the same planet. So yeah, it's a good point what you're saying.
Anyway,
So you're saying it's a combination of memories from the Vedic Indic tradition combined with Leelas that actually happened outside of
oh
the
yeah, well, I mean, as far as Saint Christopher goes, it's almost concluded by all the scholars that I'm familiar with that are writing about Saint Christopher. You know, I mean, and some pretty good information there. But basically, that this story has somehow been circulated. It's kind of disjointed. It's not genuine. They all pretty much agree on that. It's, you know, so it's kind of fabricated from some other material. So it's not just my conclusion on it. It's just.
But with the Ramayana being, according to Vedic tradition, right, 2 million years ago, to the point where the real Lanka's like probably submerged in the middle of the Indian Ocean, the Seychelles Islands maybe being a remainder, right? And so, and then we find the same Ramayana is considered indigenous to the cultures of Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Tibet,
Right.
Nepal. They all have their own version, Thailand, of the same Ramayana with the same beings. But there are variations in the storylines, but the archetypes never change, if I'm correct.
Well, that's why I'm saying Saint Christopher belongs to that same body of and it's just a European take on it. And within this, I know there's probably other things I won't mention right away, but he belongs within that same tradition. And as far as I can understand, you know, when you see it, like they say, well, you know, there's these similarities across the world, but you know, there's a similarity that you can see immediately in every human being. So what's the big, you know, discovery that there's similarities across the world? You know, obviously we're similar to each other no matter how we're looking at it, you know. So, yeah, but anyway, yeah, so this St. Christopher is part of that. It's part of that tradition that is part of the 300 different versions of Ramayana, and it's related to that tradition. And as we can go into the categories already about meeting in the wilderness, crossing the water, which is a big part in the Ramayana where Hanuman leaps across Lanka. It's a very famous scene. And then the building of the bridge, which is an extremely famous scene also, where Lord Ram and the whole entire Vanara army get to cross and all that stuff. So we have the same kind of episodes in the different apocrypha, this, which is Andrew Matthias, the Acts of Andrew Matthias, the Acts of with Gatsa Caleb, the face of a dog, Acts of Andrew Bartholomew, sorry, the Acts of Christopher, the Passions of Christopher, and of course the stories of Saint Minas and Saint Mercurius. And just to explain all that. But further, we have, like I said, crossing the water, enter the city, and bringing the gates down. This is another thing that we find, but where Hanuman brings the gatekeeper down, and Andrew calls down the gates. And of course, bound and tortured is in every episode where they're bound and tortured. And willingly, we find out this is the case with Christopher as it is with Hanuman. In other words, Hanuman did not have to be bound, but he wanted to be brought before the 10-headed Dashanana, just as Christopher was brought before Decius and Dogmas. But he willingly was bound just so he could have this audience. So in the same case of Christopher and Hanuman, we have the same idea of them willingly going before the judge because they were unable to bound them.
Wow, those are incredible parallels. Really amazing.
And this set of flame, set of fire, but unhurt. So all of them are set of flame. Andrew, Matthias, Gatsa Caleb, Christopher, Mercurius Minas, and Hanuman. All of these episodes, they're all set of fire, but they remain unhurt. And Christopher, we practically have the exact parallels there, bringing the pots and pouring it. And with Hanuman bringing the pots and pouring on his tail, we have the same. Then the city burns or is enclosed in fire. We have also that, you know. And
so Hanuman is like, Hanuman gets his tail set on fire. It's like lathered in oil and it's set aflame, and then he like carries that all around Lanka and destroys King Ravana's kingdom. Does Saint Christopher have a parallel with that?
Yes, the city sets on fire, and we're just getting to that right now. The city sets on fire. Andrew Bartholomew, city encircled in fire. Gatsakalev wreaks havoc on the city of Bartos. Christopher, because of his on flame, some of the houses in the city are set on fire. And Macorius, once again, ring of fire and all this thing. And anyway, so it's all parallels the city, but there's also other scenes of destruction too. And the one right parallel directly here is Hanuman is Gatsakalev wreaking havoc on the city of Barthos, and Hanuman also doing the same in the city of Lanka, plus setting it on fire. Then we have reviving the dead. And this is what we know Hanuman did. And this is also attributed to Gatsakalev. This is attributed to Andrew Matthias. And it also, this is equated with converting the public. Before all their martyrdoms, and we see the martyrdoms are pretty much like we have, I want to say Macorius, martyred by Decius also. And with the dog-headed army, he was the head of the dog-headed, where we have Christopher martyred by Decius. And this is the Roman army and dog-headed. The dog-headed were soldiers that Macorius went to the cannibal cities, as Gatsakalev is in the cannibal cities. So we see the same exact, pretty much the same elements between Christopher and Macorius and Gatsakalev almost all the time.
Okay, we're gonna have to take a brief commercial break here, but when we come back, we'll be discussing dogs and their association with death, decay, and cannibalism.
Well, this is it. This is, yeah. Are we going then?
Yes. Thank you for turning into this installment. We'll be back. All right, welcome back to the show with myself, Kalia, and Vrindavan. Where we left off. We said that we would be talking about the notion of dog-headedness having to do with death. You know, the word canine has some similarities to cannibal. It has some similarities to Canaanite, etymologically speaking, or just glossally speaking. You know, with the syllable sounds, canine, cannibal, and Canaanite sound similar in that way. But there's also the notion of the dog-headed guide of the dead, and that is Anubis, or even the later Hermanubis of the Greek tradition, has some of these martyred parallels that we're describing here. And so the dog-headed one is sort of related to a guide of the death, and a guide to the dead, for the dead, and that is sort of in tandem to what Kalia was saying earlier with Saint Christopher being a resurrector or
yeah,
healer.
It's a case. That's the case. What you find out with Hanuman, he resurrects Lord Ram and Lakshman. In the version I have, Valmiki Ramayana version I have, you have Hanuman resurrecting them twice. But Garuda, he's the first person to come and resurrect Lord Ram and Lakshman, and when they're hit by the snake arrows. So that's Garuda, because he's enemy of snakes. He's the first person to take care of the poison or resurrect the Lord in that sense. And then in the other two episodes, it's Hanuman that resurrects the Lord, not only the Lord, but the entire army, by bringing the mountain of herbs. And so in this way, yes, you find the healing association, like I was saying, in the Gatsakalev, the episode of Gatsakalev specifically. And St. Christopher, you have the blossoming, the palm tree. But the parallel, the Ethiopic parallel we were talking about was God's Caleb, the face of the dog, who is the ordained Christianus. In other words, after meeting Andrew and Bartholomew, he becomes ordained Christian, just as Saint Christopher does when he becomes a servant of Christ. You know, he becomes ordained as Christophorus because of carrying Christ. So you pretty much have the same episodes of him entering the city, all that stuff, and then the dead. He revives all the dead people that he killed for some strange reason, but that's what's in God's Caleb. In Saint Christopher, it's the conversion of those people with this blossoming palm, and this blossoming palm is, well, just to be short about the history of the blossoming palm, we find it with a lot of saints. We're gonna go all the way back to Hermes Mercury, and we're gonna see this blossoming palm, and the same idea is represented in Saint Christopher. But basically, this palm tree was a kind of like a kalpataru tree, and he could just sit it in wherever he wanted to. And there's a few other saints that had similar stories like this, you know. And so there he was out in the desert. So he took the blossoming palm and he put it before the people in the city of Lycia, according to this, when they went to Samos and Lycia. Well, I mean, of the many cities, the one I'm mentioning here is specifically Lycia or Samos and Lycia, or places like this, you know. And so he takes a blossoming palm and basically converts the citizens from demonic to, Christian, which is the parallel of, God's Caleb reviving, or the conversion of the citizens, or anyway, so that's part of it. That's part of the healing history. When we go into Mercurius, when we go to Minos, when we go into these different saints, we see they have similar healing connotations to them. Anyway, so as far as like the rescue going to the underworld, as far as Anubis goes, we know he's the Lord that was the we want to call psychopomp, almost what they call Hermes and all this. In other words, he was the one who judged the souls. He was the Lord supposed to be of the underworld. But in Hermanubis, we find all the symbols of Hermes Mercury. We find the ram, we find the caduceus, we find the what's the other one? He's got the rooster. You know, so these are all symbols that are always accompanying Hermanubis. She's got the dog head, not always, but generally speaking, you'll see that they accompany him. And in the one where you see his anguiped form of Hermanubis, you see that he's also got the poppies, the whole thing, the herbs in his hand. And so he also carries those herbs too. And you'll see this in Hanuman from his South Indian Mukhya Prana Devaru. Now, this is a very popular idea of Hanuman, where he generally speaking does not have a club, but he carries a blossom. It's either in this Sugandhika lotus flower, or it's in this cluster of blossoms that are herbs. The third thing you're going to see, so that's one thing. So you see Hanuman carries a herbal mountain, right? And the second thing is you see the herbs that Hanuman is carrying. So this is predicted. This is a kind of depiction that's popularly known in South India, according to how I understand. And there's over 700 and some temples dedicated to this idea of Hanuman is chief of wind gods, Mukhya Prana Devaru. And he carries a flower or a blossom in his hand. And the third thing you're going to see is Hanuman carrying a chalice, like this, dude. And so one represents the mountain. That's when the raw product. The one represents the product when it's actually, picked from from its roots and being prepared. And the third one, the chalice, represents the distilled product. And this you're going to find in the different messenger deities and so on and so on, But this is one thing that we see in the blossoming palm when Christopher, Saint Christopher plants that palm. This same idea of the palm tree as we find in other saints. So the healing, the reviving, the resuscitation of the palm, and the idea of conversion because they're becoming enlightened. Their lives are coming back again. Anyway, so yeah,
that those are some good associations. I was wondering about because I was talking with Bryn for a moment. I don't know what he's what he's up to in the background now, but he seemed to be confused that the Saint Christopher was a part of the Judaic tradition and that he was like pre-Christ, or that he had something to do with Jesus Christ as of like 2,000 years ago. But isn't Saint Christopher like a few centuries after the fact? Why does he have these pastimes
Well,
with Christ and bearing him?
right. Well, according to how I understand, Saint Christopher is a product of the Apocrypha between 2nd century and 5th century AD, as we already mentioned. But this is at the time when we see known as Dionysica, which Sir William Jones pointed out also. And we can see the Ramayana is turned on its head. In the same way, we see the reprobate Santa Claus. So we know very likely that this is from an earlier story and an earlier character who's creating St. Christopher. If you're going back in the Greeks, the earliest you're going to find is probably Sylvanus. You know who Sylvanus is? You know, Dionysus and his main, I want to say satyr attendant, his main attendant, who's always pictured with Dionysus all the time. And he's the horse-tailed satyr and all that stuff. You know what I mean? And he's the stepfather, foster father to Dionysus. And a lot of images you'll see he's carrying the young child Dionysus on his shoulder, and you'll see that, and also in some images, and you can see he's a hair-covered satyr. He's fully covered by hair. He doesn't have any goat horns. He's fully human, except for he's got a long tail. And that's how they called the horse-tailed satyr. And this was the Greek. And between 8th century, 4th century BC, you're going to see a lot of these images of the satyr depicted exactly like this. Known as satyr, they include bull horns. But before that time, you can see the satyr was considered to be another type of man, which is called the horse-tailed satyr. Now, other different categories, ape, monkey, bear, that you have from the Ramayana, and this is very popular whenever you're reading any lore about woodland giants and all this stuff, you'll see that resemblance is always there between ape, monkey, bear, but you have a subcategory called Golangala, which Hanuman belongs to, and as Sir William Jones pointed out, Hanuman, but he said Hanuman and Pan, but also there's Pan Sylvanus, which is Sylvanus with the features of Pan. But in the Greek, you basically find that Sylvanus has a human features. He's got a little kind of maybe donkey-like ears, but his hands and feet are completely human. He doesn't have any horns. He wears the ivy crown. He's got the white beard always. He carries the Thyrsus staff, just as Dionysus, and he rides a donkey. All right, and so you see all these things in Sylvanus. So if you're looking at, and plus, he's the bearer of the young Dionysus, or the child Dionysus. He becomes a foster father. First, you see the bearers of the Dionysus are Hermes, Mercury, Eris, and also Hermes, Mercury with Heracles, Hermes, Mercury, and Silenus, the main attendant. Now, he's the attendant, because some people say, well, the name Sylvanus, because his Italian name, his Latin name is Sylvanus, his Greek name is Silenus. And he's the head of Selenoi. And he's the head of the satyrs. That's who he is. And he's a satyr or horse-tailed satyr. Now, Hanuman's called the Golangala, which that translates in Sanskrit as first monkey, as cow-tailed, go, and the second translation is horse. So if you're looking at the Greek translation, it's definitely the same translation that they're using for these satyr that are attendants of Dionysus, just as Hanuman, being a Golangala with the long tails, is attendant to Lord Ram.
So going back to the destruction of the city with Gatsakolab and Hanuman tearing down Lanka, which was Ravana's kingdom, according to the Ramayana tradition, it's that Hanuman wasn't the original cause of ruin for the city of Lanka. That was more because the evil king kidnapped Sita Devi, and that's was Rama's beloved.
Well,
so
we have a parallel to that. Yeah, I wouldn't say it's an exact parallel, but we do have one in Matthias being kidnapped, you know, and then Matthias had to be kidnapped and be rescued by Andrew. Here, though, Matthias is given, I'm trying, if I can find it, it'd be great. You know, there's the thing, but he's given like 2 months, I believe, maybe 3 months or something like that, and before he'll be eaten by the man-eaters. As you see that, Mother Sita, same kind of idea. She's given like, what, a month or 2 months or something. It's not the same time, I know that, but it's a similar idea of a few months before Robin threatens to come back and, you know, completely eat. But, okay, that's not all. We have the martyrdoms of the two ladies, the two, what do you call it, virgins. Well, I'm going to say virgins, but basically they're being called saints, and that is, I'm trying to remember the name of them. This thing can go faster. Let me think of the name here. Oh, hold on a second. I'm just trying to find it for a second. I'm sorry. Let's see what's happening here. Anyway, but there's two. Aquilonia is one, and Nicaea is the other. And as you can see, Nicaea sent to Christopher to tempt him, but he turns them into saints. And she is put into the fire, but she comes out unharmed. But finally, somehow, just as St. Christopher goes through all his ordeals and comes out unharmed, she somehow, you know, what do you say, inexplicably beheaded. She's, so, I mean, despite the fact that they couldn't kill her. So this is part of the whole martyrdom, you know, that this has been pointed out. So in that way, you got the same idea of Mother Sita. And you have her being saved by the fire goddess and so on. And, oh, you know.
Yeah, the story about the fire god there, he like keeps a version of Sita inside and only lets out this illusory version for King Robin to enjoy.
Well, see, yeah, the illusory version is the idea. But the parallels there are that when Indrajit comes, you know, with an illusory Mother Sita, and he slays that illusory Mother Sita in front of Lord Ram. And in the same way that Mother Sita is cut or sliced in half, we find that Nicaea is also not, first she's burned in fire, but then the second part is she's sliced in half, or she's sliced by these instruments. Well, both these stories have Aquilonia and Nicaea. And sometimes, anyway, I don't want to quote on that because it's too difficult for that right now, but these two, but the idea of fire and being cut in half is also there, and also the idea of being eaten.
It's amazing. Basically, you're saying if you take the Ramayana template and you compare it with the Saint Christopher template, the parallels are almost exact. You know, yeah. Every incident, whether you have crossing the water, the fire, the killing, it's like a carbon copy, basically.
It's more detailed than that. I mean, we have Mother Sita being saved by the fire god and fire goddess, but.
So yeah, it's real interesting. It's like brings up so many questions and points. But one thing I want to get to right away, obviously, with the Santa gear, Santa beard, Santa hat, and Elijah and I are like Santa elves. And so how does this all tie in to Santa and Christmas? Because we chose today as our day of recording, first day of Christmas. So what's the connection with Santa?
Okay. This is the connection here. I'm gonna give you the all right here in a nutshell. Okay, well, all the stuff we were saying. Now, how is Saint Christopher related with Santa Claus? How is Hanuman related with Santa Claus? And by the way, Hanuman Jayanti is coming on the 22nd. That's for Tamil Nadu.
The South
So
Indian.
that's for South India only. That's only for certain regions in and around the area of Tamil Nadu, which is still several 100 million people. So you gotta
A
be
super
still,
ancient part of the Indian culture too.
all right. All right, and besides that, it's celebrated on
So
the 5th.
to point out the obvious, December 22, December 25,
Yeah.
Hanuman 22nd, Saturnalia Christmas, December 25th.
All right. All right. Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you. Yes. Anyway, yeah, right. And so, right, 22nd is the solstice. That's the actual solstice time. And Hanuman's celebration day is every solstice day, of course, every winter solstice day, as I found out, you know, at least in Tamil Nadu. And so this year, 22nd, and as we know, well, I don't know, we all know, but I kind of, you know, sort of know. So. Sun enters Capricorn. In Karnataka, those surrounding areas, they have it on December 5th, 6th, and they're saying, well, this is because of the ancient calendar date of the sun entering into the ancient month of Margashirsha, which we know is Krishna's month, which is equivalent with basically Sagittarius and basically the stag-headed, the hunter, the roe, the danos, the stuff like that. It's called Margashirsha, it's called deer's head. So it's different than the idea of Danu. And so 22nd, the sun enters on our current date in Capricorn. And as we see that Hanuman is celebrated on this day. Well, whether or not he has anything to do with the fact that Capricorn is the mount of the newly born deity, you know, and this is Eros. And we've heard of Eros proto-Janus, and we know Eros, the newborn deity, and he rides upon this Capricorn, which is a goat fish. It's not a goat, but it's a goat fish, right? And it's, you know, it's a strange looking thing that has a tail and all that stuff. And the equivalent of that is what's called a makara, which is actually just kind of the same thing, because that's actually the same, you know, month and so on, which they call finally up to Makara Shankaranti, and which is the month of this Makara entering the Makara. Makara Dwaj and Kamadev rides upon this Makara Dwaj. So that Kamadev, he is just the same deity as Eros, right? The same deity, the same guy. He's the god of love, he's Cupid, they're both Cupid. And you can see the baby little Cupid riding on the Capricorn, like, oh, you know, he's all happy and stuff like that. And so this is also the same thing in the Vedic tradition with Kamadev riding upon Makara and Makara Dwaj. And that ceremony of, now don't quote me on this, but 360,000 or 360 gods and goddesses. In other words, it's not just 360, it's whatever that is times 2. But they all come together on Kamadev's birthday, this day of the year when he comes out, or when he finally, I guess, when it goes into the equinox, I guess, or if I'm, you know, anyway, don't quote me on that one either. But so anyway, he's the deity being reborn. He's the Cupid being reborn, and he's being carried by this Capricorn. You know, and so here's the goat fish, and sometimes you'll see Santa's on a goat. You know, he's riding a goat, or Saint Nick rides a goat, or not. Sometimes he rides a goat, sometimes he rides a donkey, like the old Sylvanus used to ride the donkey, and he had the long beard and he had the ivy crown. And so if you go through this phase, you're going to see that they're related with who's called the Woodwoes. And the Woodwoes are the wild men. They're in the churches and temples, medieval churches and temples and throughout Europe. And you can see them all over the walls, and they're protectors. They got the big tree branches they're holding on to, you know, and they also got them on all of their emblems, like the official Lapland, Sweden. Lapland is the emblem of Jules, the wild man, and he's a red color. It's supposed to be a recent creation in the last few hundred years, but still he's a very red color, like Hanuman when he's covered with the red sindoor. Even though there's many other depictions of the wild men, either wild women or wild men together on all of these different official emblems and, you know, seals throughout Europe, you know, nobility, and you see it also there. Now this place where Jules, as you see, he's standing, he looks just like Santa Claus. He's got a red beard, he's got, not a red beard, but a white beard, but he's got the holly crown, or I mean the leaf crown. It might not be holly, but you know, just as Sylvanus has the ivy crown. And he's girded with the wild men, the traditional wild men, you know, garb, which is having a leaf dress, and you know what I mean? And also, you know, having a tree branch or tree club, thing like that. But the only thing difference is they're contesting as one of the main people contesting as a home of Santa Claus. So who is Santa Claus, someone might ask, but in the idea, he's called a Yule Tomte. And a Tomte, as we all know, is a little elf. He's a little dwarf. He's kind of, in some traditions, he's a troll, and this and that, and so on and so on. You know, and as you can see, his little helpers are named Sinterklaas, Ashen Claus, Rube Claus, which all names mean ash covered, cinder covered, you know what I mean? And all of these other things. So they're rough, you know, rough kind of guy. So the name Santa Claus is actually contested whether or not it actually came from this name of Cinder Claus. And this is a tradition because of the chimney sweep that we were talking about. Puck's Shakespeare, the chimney sweep, all that stuff, you know. So in this, you know, you see that we had a picture of the ballad, that 16th century English Shakespearean ballad, the cover, which shows that on one side it has a poem, but it has Oberon, who's considered to be the Lord of the Fairies, the King of the Fairies, and he's Puck's father. And some people say that's actually Puck himself. But you can see he's the same Holly King. He has the same crown. He's got the same, carries the same staff, the same big tree. He's got the same leaf gird, everything. You know, so this is appearing, and it's put on these ballads to indicate that this is who they're talking about. This is the kind of beings they're talking about when they're talking about Puck. You know, he's a shapeshifter, and he can change his shape to a horse or a monkey or whatever, you know. And he's a chimney sweep. And his chimney sweep, if he meets you, it's supposed to be good luck, you know. And this is the thing. And he's always covered in ash, and he's always laughing, ho, 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 like this. And through every line, he laughs, ho, 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 you know. So, and you can see the Ashen Claus, the Cinder Claus, and Santa Claus being a jolly old elf, as we know in the poem. And he was covered with ash, soot from the chimney, you know. He's covered with soot from the chimney. And you can see that direct relation with that wild man holding that staff, the same wild man you see all throughout these emblems and even on the churches, part of the pagan past, so-called, you know. But they're guarding just like Hanuman guards the temple with his images, or you might have other images of yakshas and so on, and Garuda. So just in the same way, you see these images, and a lot of them have the wild men, the guard with the holly crown, with the leaf crowns and the leaf girds, and maybe they have some kind of animal skin or something like this, and you know. So you see the same thing in Silenus, and you see not only this from the Greek, but if you're going to the Latin, if you're going to the Gallo-Rome, all these different territories, especially where it becomes San Silanus, you'll see he wears this animal skin a lot. He carries different types of staff. Sometimes it's a club, sometimes it's a Thyrsus staff, sometimes it's a, you know, and often carries a libation cup of some time, or sometimes a kantaros, the drinking cup, you know, the Greeks and stuff, things like this. So, and in the Sucellos of Venice, he has also, he puts out his, it's either a cornucopia, but you can see it's the same idea of the medicinal cup. You know, the same thing going on there. And he has a big hammer that he carries with him, you know.
Are there any points that you would want to touch upon before we make our closing remarks?
The closing, we got it. There's going to be closing already.
It's getting late for me. What do you guys think?
Yeah.
I got a 10-minute warning just now.
I have a question, but like you were saying on the phone, Elijah, we might need to consider the political connotations. But I was just curious, like, what are we exactly saying here? Or what is Neil saying exactly in terms of if we went back to 200 AD and we saw Western Asia, Eastern Mediterranean region, right? And obviously this Ramayana, I guess that's the question. Was the Ramayana culture already native and well known to these communities of the Eastern Mediterranean, West Asia region, and was part of the Christian conversion process involved, quote unquote, co-opting already accepted traditions of the locals, like the European version of the Ramayana or the Turkish, Anatolian version of the Ramayana. And then the Christians adopted them to make the transition to Christianity easier. Or were these stories brought over by a few adventurers and wanderers and kind of integrated into the tradition? And so what are we looking at when, like, say we time traveled back to that time? What are we seeing here? And how did the influence and the knowledge of the Ramayana template get so deep in these societies? Were they practicing some kind of Vaishnavism in that part of the world? And then when Christianity came, they kind of adopted it into it or mixed it in. What are we talking about?
Are you asking me? Oh, yeah.
Yes, I'm asking you, Sir Neil.
Oh, I'm not an expert on all of that, but I would say.
Oh, do you have an idea? Like, what do you think? Like,
well, I there's no question for me that, whatever we have, we've inherited the same thing, So
going back thousands and thousands of years, obviously, since the Ramayana is 1 million, 2 million years old on this planet, according to the traditional perspective.
Right.
So it passed down through countless generations, right? But I'm not exaggerating. If you go to Laos right now, or Vietnam, or Thailand, and you, or Cambodia, and you talk to them about their Ramayana traditions, they're considered indigenous to this cultures, even though mainstream scholars would say, oh, it was brought over by Indians or travelers or whatever. But according to their tradition, Philippines too, it's as indigenous as you can get, So
well, I feel as if there's a general idea of world heritage, and then there's the local stories that are coming between that, so on, and then in this case I think it's a blend of both of that.
But we need to also, another serious concern or issue is that, especially within the Vedic tradition and also within the so-called Abrahamic traditions, Christian, Islam, Judaic, you couldn't just wake up one day and say, wow, I had a new realization, everyone, check this out, it's straight from God. And there was a process of legitimacy that was involved before you can share a new Siddhanta, promote a new Siddhanta, preach a new Siddhanta, right? And so I really would like a capture, freeze frame the cultural, socio-political situation of what we're dealing with here. The Ramayana wasn't just artificially accepted and brought in, right? So what is the source exactly of the Saint Christopher legend, which is so obvious?
The same, as well as the thing. If you're asking me, I'm simply saying that there's an ancient thing that just went on, and it's apparent that there's an attempt to try to reintroduce Saint Christopher, Santa Claus, and all these different what they call the basket over types. you know. So so those guys were kind of written over. They were kind of given
So like another way to put it is like if we went to the top Vatican theological scholar in the Vatican today, what would be their opinion of these legends of Saint Christopher?
Yeah, I don't know what they're. I don't really know, but I would say that yeah. I mean, a lot of people want to place Saint Christopher as purely, you know, with a martial career and then a martyrdom, and you know, and say that he was a genuine person and actually lived and died. Of course, and you have to describe you have to make for the overwhelming, you know, outstanding descriptions of Christopher, you know, and of course the related literatures like God,
Could there have been more than one time the name Saint Christopher applied to someone? And couldn't they be different individuals? So we will have Krishna, kings in ancient India named Krishna, and then there's actually the Lord Sri Krishna, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't say myself.
Okay, so but definitely it's totally obvious and undeniable that this Ramayana template is deep within the ancient European spiritual tradition.
I think that if alone by itself, the fact that if you're looking at, like we said, the Indica and known as Dionysica, you're going to see that it was already it was definitely for the last, what, how many centuries between.
So that's pre-Christian then.
3rd century BC at least. We're talking about at least to 5th century AD. So at least from that time, we understand that there was this knowledge of the Indian religion and you know, that being put into the Greek literatures and Greek stories taken. So, yeah, I don't, personally, all I can say is that because of my personal thoughts, I guess, are because of the reform, this is what we're looking at. And we're looking at the reform of St. Christopher as a doghead, how to explain that. Outside of that, he's some kind of demon or he's some kind of pagan, you know, deity or something like that. So they don't know how to explain this, you know, but he was accepted all throughout Europe and places like that, just as that.
But through the mundane scholarly perspective, that would be considered a pagan deity. Hanuman.
Right, so there was a need during that time, during the reform years, to change Christopher's image. They weren't able to change it all, but they did a lot. And he became, generally speaking, a giant human carrying a giant staff, just like you see the same image of the wild men, same sacred wild men who guard, like we were just saying, on the cathedrals and holy places and the official emblems of Europe. The same image of Christopher appeared in that time, you know, as an alternative. But here he is, still under the features. Just alone that he's a warrior from a Roman army can't fit his description. Doesn't explain why he's got such unusual descriptions. You know, being either a giant or being either a doghead. So there's something. So yeah, I feel as if you can say that the Ramayana was known in Europe at one point. This practically, almost speaking, proves it. I mean, if you're looking at the Nonius pitting against the Dariades in the war where Dionysus conquers India, you know, and a few centuries earlier, you have similar ideas, as we know. We were talking about that earlier. So yeah, that alone says that it's more than enough to suggest that, you know, this is exactly what was happening. And during reform, and this is what happened to Santa Claus also. The Santa Claus, well, we have Santa Claus in these two forms. We have the holy wild man, and as we were talking about jewels, the Lapland jewels being the image, the spitting image of Santa Claus, practically speaking, you know, and holding the club and everything like that. But in truth, the description is like that. We have what's called a basket ogre, and we have the holy wild man. And in some stories, you'll see that they come together, like in Bell's Nickel, the German Bell's Nickel. They don't know about Santa Claus.
Well, sorry if I'm cutting you
No.
off here, Neil, but that about wraps it up for our show tonight, and perhaps we'll pick up this topic another time, maybe in our next episode. But for now, I've got to bid my friends adieu and wish everyone a Merry Christmas. If you guys could do the same.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. Thank you so
Merry
much, Alon,
Christmas.
for hosting.